Today, it's my lucky day. I get to interview Larry Galan, who has done a lot of work helping startups grow and learn and go, and then ultimately probably even sell for piles of money. I mean, that's what a lot of startups are. So, how you doing, Larry?
Warren, good to be here with you.
Did I capture you kind of what you do
I
correctly? Why don't
think
you
I think
add
that's
on to
an
that?
adequate. I'd probably say startup struggler because as anyone who's worked at a startup, you never run out of problems. I really think of myself as more a problem solver, if you will.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
So
I like that. And that, yeah, you better love to start. You better love to solve problems if you're going to have a startup, correct?
100%, 100%.
So, how did you get into a business like this?
So a little bit about me. I'm from the Northeast originally. For me, I remember very vividly as a kid watching Steve Jobs' speech that he gave at Stanford, which is you got to find the things you do in life that make you happy and that add value. And so I remember watching that speech maybe 100 times. And I always knew that in college, I wanted to do something entrepreneurial. I've always been fascinated by people that come from, varying backgrounds. Maybe they didn't go to college, or maybe they didn't have the right education and they went and they ended up building something. I've always found that truly tremendous and interesting about the human condition, and I always knew that longer term I wanted to work in the startup realm. So I went to college up in the Northeast. I studied business. I did 2 years in sort of the finance corporate setting, but I always found myself coming back to that idea about, will I ever be ready to actually start a business? And so one day when I was about, 23, 24, I decided, you know what, I'm just going to make the jump. And I ended up working for a startup as the third person. And that startup at the time was a fintech company. It was a trading organization, really, really fresh, 3 people. But was lucky to see that business scale over the next 2 years from employee 3 or 4 that I was to dozens of employees, offices in multiple countries, seeing it scale, become a really, really successful business. And so that bug and seeing what can happen if you have the right team and you've got the right processes in place has basically stayed with me ever since. So I've been over the last 10 years involved with varying number, about 3 different startups. Most recently, I was CEO of energia.com, which is an energy investing marketplace. It's done about $1 billion worth of oil and gas ABS transactions and private placements. And it's currently been quite involved in the energy space here in Houston. I'm a Houston native currently. I really like to travel, and in my spare time, I am also a mentor like yourself to startups.
That's wonderful. Okay. So, thinking about these startups, what are the biggest challenges these startups face and how do you overcome those?
I think there are just so many of them, but if I could pinpoint one of them, it's not getting enough feedback from your customer quickly enough and learning from it.
Oh,
So the best example I can give of this is, I'm sure everyone is probably familiar with Potbelly, the sandwich shop.
mhm.
What a lot of people don't realize is that Potbelly, when it was started, was not a sandwich shop. So it's actually, I think it's established in 1970 or so. It's set up in Chicago, but the initial use case of what Potbelly was something completely different. It was an antique store. So
What?
imagine where you get your sandwiches right now was actually selling, your old mom and pop china and furniture. But the funny story there is they started as an antique store, and the owners realized pretty quickly, hey, we're not selling any antiques. But what they did have is one of those old potbelly stoves that they
Huh.
used in their office. And so what they ended up is they turned it on and they started making sandwiches on that stove. Lo and behold, people started coming to the store for the sandwiches. And all of a sudden, their use case completely changed. So even though they had come up with the idea of, hey, we're going to start this great antique store, the business had to pivot based on the customer. And I think the ability to quickly pivot when your customer tells you to do so is critical. It's, I think, what differentiates a successful startup and someone that struggles. It's also the basis for most lean startup theory that is really being advocated right now in Silicon Valley and in New York.
So, obviously that customer feedback was cash register and that's a big tell. How
Mhm.
else do you what's the other? I mean, you obviously can ask your customers, But
Yep.
when you say gain customer feedback, can you expand on that? Because I think it's brilliant. So
Sure. I think it's, you can do it in a variety of different ways. And I think over the last 5 to 10 years, it's really changed a lot. So you can do it in different ways. In the mid 2010s, a lot of people were doing it with ads, right? So you could run brand awareness campaigns on Facebook, on Meta, on Instagram, on LinkedIn. And all of a sudden, you could integrate systems like you could run an ad on Twitter or on Instagram or Facebook. You could direct people to a landing page and you could come up with pretty quick metrics. Hey, how many people are clicking on my website? How many people, let's say, create an account? How many people reach out to me? And all of a sudden, you can come up with a funnel. And you might be wrong at an individual customer level, but when you've got data on, call it 1,000, 2,000 customers, you can make some pretty inferred decisions really quickly on whether there's traction for your product. Now, I think over the last few years, the cost of advertising in general has gone up on these advertising platforms because there's more demand than ever.
sure.
And so what's really interesting to see is I'm seeing more and more people now focus much more on content. So they do podcasts, they do events, they do conferences, they do a variety of different things to actually meet the customer in person. And I think that is really where we're going toward, where people are moving away from just your traditional ad format to they're looking for content. And if you get engagement on your content, that's probably a good indication that you're getting market traction.
Yeah, that's great. Or lack of engagement on your content.
Exactly.
That would
But this is the
indicate
thing,
an
it
alternative.
takes time. It takes time. And, even like something I recently started creating a Twitter account. And, in August, I had 0 followers. I've just never used Twitter, right? But after speaking to another serial entrepreneur who recently got $20 million in funding, he told me, I have basically built my brand around Twitter. And had I not had Twitter, I wouldn't have been able to make all of these great connections. So I produce content, people like my content, and it took them years to get there. But you start day one, and you start with 5, maybe 4 replies a day, 5 replies a day, and 1 post. But over time, 0 followers turns into 10, turns into 100, turns into 1,000, and then once you get to the 5 to 10,000 realm, it spreads like wildfire in many
Hmm,
instances.
that's brilliant. Okay, so tell me, this is a question I've always curious about. How do you decide between the priorities of like speed to market versus product perfection or service perfection versus cash flow? Because those are all they don't always go together.
They're all important, but I think they come at various times, right? Ultimately, everyone cares about cash flow, but I think if you're a startup and you're building a business, if I had to pick one, it would be speed to market. To me, in my mind, speed to market is the most important thing, and it's the basis of lean startup theory because I think every entrepreneur, even though they might be super brilliant, super talented, they know exactly the perfect use case. You almost never, unless you're, one of these really rare individuals like Elon Musk, who's a visionary and knows exactly what the customer wants and can move in the direction of the puck that they're going toward. Most people can't. I can't, for example. And so as a result, I want to build my organization such that I can pivot and learn from the customer as quickly as possible. Now, I'll give you a great example. Here's another good story. I'm full of stories, by the way, and let me
I
know
love it.
if you get sick of these. But one of my favorite examples of this is Slack. So everyone uses Slack for their instant messaging. They either use Slack or Microsoft Teams. Um, what a lot of people don't realize is that before Slack was Slack, they were actually a company called Glitch. And what they were doing is they were building a massive multiplayer online video game. So they raised 20 million in VC funding, and they spent 2 years building this 2D multiplayer video game. They
Okay.
launched it. The founders loved it. They were huge video game nerds. It completely failed. It did not scale at all. They got 0 customers, and they spent, I think, 16 out of that 20 million on this game that completely flopped.
Oh my goodness.
And so they're facing an existential crisis. What do I do with my business now? Because I've built this product and no one wants it. And so what they ended up doing is what they had done in the meantime is even though they didn't have a video game, they had built this really, really small tool. in their office for the different developer teams to communicate with each other. Really simple, a very, very MVP basic version of Slack. Um, and so what they did have is they had a lot of connections in Silicon Valley. So they emailed all their friends and they said, "Hey, we built this tool. We don't quite know what it might be useful for, but we use it all the time. Do you want to try it out?" And so they pursued that strategy, and all of a sudden they got their key niche audience, which are developers. They launched it. They started using them. The product team started, and then they started getting traction. But they basically, in that little business, which was, they probably were what, the 1,000th instant messenger communication, became Slack. So it's a really interesting story how you can build something, fail, quickly pivot, but then also pivot into an industry that has huge amount of competition. But if you have your right niche audience, you can still scale a business. I've always found that story unbelievably fascinating.
That's amazing. So do you think they succeeded because their product isn't, I don't think in many ways superior to some of the competitors, right? But they found the audience and they got scale with the audience.
They found their, I think that's the thing, which is, and what most people argue is, don't go for the huge audience, go for the niche. Go for your early adopters that you have created a viable product for them, but that you basically, if you can get them to accept your product, you've got a market and you can always pivot from there. But it's finding that niche audience. And I think what Slack was able to do is they found that niche audience rather than so many other companies that go broad. They've got these broad based campaigns and they don't focus on one individual segment. They try to, be everything to everyone.
Great. I love that. All right. So switching gears here, thinking about a startup or any company and the value of a company, and that's team. So tell me, how do you decide who your team should be? How do you find them? When do you hire them? Tell me about that.
Obviously, building a team is probably the hardest part, and it's one of the most crucial things. I think, what do most people say? Hire slow and fire fast. You really want to take the time to meet the people and make sure that they're great cultural fits. And that can mean a variety of different things. It means that they're smart, means that they're engaged, and it means maybe a little bit that they have maybe a little bit of a chip on their shoulder and they're willing to do things and help grow the business in maybe some unconventional ways. I've always appreciated people that think outside of the box. Another thing that I think is really critical is hiring people that are open to disagreeing with each other. I think what makes a great startup is having, a junior person or a partner be willing to tell you when you're wrong, because a founder, generally they're pretty siloed. They often have a vision of the business, but they're more often wrong than right. And having that team that can help guide them is super critical. And being able to have a team that is able to provide feedback both to your employees, but also accept it, is really what's going to make the difference.
Yeah, that's great. So you really need, then you got to have somebody with fire in the belly and somebody that has some passion, and then somebody that can think outside the box, but is okay with speaking up. And that means you have to have the culture to allow them to speak up and encourage that, because you only get one chance at that. And if you squash it, it'll never happen again.
100%, 100%. And if the employee thinks that you don't value their opinion, they're just going to go to the next door and accept a job at a competitor. And high quality talent is so hard to replace. So you have to motivate them, you have to inspire them, and you have to give them a vision for why they're working.
That's great. Yeah, high quality talent is hard to replace, and they are very in demand. And mediocre people will always be hanging around.
100%. Yeah.
It goes both ways. Okay, so tell me a thing that you've done in a past startup that you would do differently, and why.
Many things I would have done differently, because obviously hindsight's always 2020. But I think over the years of the framework that I think of what you need to be successful is really three things. The first is the ability to build a product in 2 to 3 months, so super quickly. The second is to have a product that you can scale, meaning it's not just got a very siloed use case, that, yeah, you might be able to build it, but if it doesn't grow or it's got capped growth potential, it's probably not worth pursuing. And the final one, which is probably the hardest, but the most important, is the ability to pre-sell your customers before you actually build the product. I think
Mm.
in past experiences, I've often done one and two, but three, I wish I would have done sooner. So it is never too early to market your product, even before it's built. If you can, and there are, as I've gotten older and a little bit wiser, I've realized how you can do that. You can use waiting lists, you can use forums, you can use content. There's so many different ways, but if you can sell your product before you actually build it to help drive the actual build process and also to determine what is the customer market fit, then I think you've got a potential to succeed.
That's awesome. So how do you, I've heard folks say that you're going to need twice as much cash as you thought you were going to need.
Oh yeah.
It's going to take twice as long. Do you agree with that? Any thoughts on that?
I think if you're aware of these biases that we all do, that we all have, if you will, like for example, like we want to perfect a product, we want to make it perfect before we launch it, and you're really you're able to basically apply lean startup methodology while you're almost always certainly going to go over your budget, or it's always almost certainly going to cost more than you think, you can really bring that cost down. And at the end of the day, I don't think businesses go out of business, startups in particular, because because it's a cash flow problem, especially when you're at an early stage. They normally go out of business because of the time required. Either, the founder gets tired, he doesn't see the sufficient scale, because normally you're building something quite lean. So the actual expenses are not huge, but it's a
No.
time commitment. It's very, very, and it can be slow. And that's why I think, time to market is so important.
Yeah, because and then the next question is obviously how do you stay in it when the time is longer and the money's longer and all those things. The results aren't quick as you want. How do you keep your head in the game? How do you keep passionate about what you're doing?
I've always found, like I said, I'm going back to that speech from Steve Jobs because it's also why. So I think that speech does a number of things. It answers your question: how do you keep doing it when the going gets tough? But I think the number one regret that people have when they look back on their life, I looked at, I think, the top three, and the number one is basically starting a business or taking more risk. And so I always, whenever I'm in a tough spot, I think, well, in my mid 30s now, I've got another 40, 50 years if I'm lucky and I'm healthy and I stay fit. And so it puts life in perspective that life is short and you should try to do things that break, that are disruptive, that are potentially scale, that can add value to people's lives. And it always, when I think of that, it makes the moments that are in the moment and seem difficult just sort of go away, if you will. It takes a long time, but it's really helped me go through the moments where, I'm struggling or I've gotten beaten up by a customer or something like that. It just, it reinvigorates me to go ahead and pick my head up the next day and try again.
That's great. That's brilliant. Okay, I'll ask you maybe one or two more questions. So if I have an idea or a product or a service, how do I know if it's a good one? What do I do?
Oof. I think it's talk to your customer, see if you can get one paying customer.
Okay.
One paying customer. That's all you need. And then from one, go to 10, and then from 10, go to 100. If you can do that, and you can do that in a relatively short amount of time, and which, is going to be different for everyone, you've got something. You've got something special.
I like that. Start with one and then get a
Yeah,
lot of feedback, right?
basically.
As you continue to acquire, just iterate, feedback.
Exactly.
Any books you would recommend for people that are thinking about starting a business?
I think it's two. So
Okay.
I recommend people reading Lean Startup, which is
Okay.
sort of, the classic. How do you build a business? What are the processes and procedures? It makes the whole argument that you'll never perfectly predict what the end customer product is. That's why you need to be more focused on building your organization and keep it dynamic and modular. The second one is a book I read a few months ago that just eye-opening book. It's called The Cold Start Problem by Andrew Chen, who's a partner at Andreessen Horowitz. And he basically talks about how do you build a network of users? How do you scale a network? How, for example, was Slack able to create a successful IMing instant messaging platform when they were probably 20 years after the first was created, and they were probably number 1,000 and they had no customers? There are certain traits and trends that occur at all these businesses that you can learn from. And what are they? Well, they're talked about in the book.
That's great. Yeah. And then one last question. Thinking about network, how do you find the right people to surround yourself with, to maybe, I don't know, help them, leverage you? How do you find the right group?
So that's a really great question. And again, I'm gonna borrow a page from Steve Jobs here to answer that, because he has a story that you can find online. When he was, I think, 12 or 13 years old, he was trying to build, I think, a frequency counter in his home, and he couldn't find the parts for it. And so what he ended up doing is, at the time, he took one of those big yellow pages and he found the CEO of Intel in Yellow Pages. And so what he did is he went to the Yellow Pages, looked up the name, and just made a call, got to the secretary, and then was able to actually connect with him. And the CEO was more than willing to give him the parts he was looking for, and actually ultimately ended up giving him an internship. And I think the message from that story is there are so many people willing to help you in this world if you just ask. But so few people are actually willing to go out of their comfort zone to ask, either because we have ego, or because we're concerned about how we might be perceived. But just asking for help, you'll often get more yeses than nos.
That is awesome. I agree. We love to help people. That's
Yeah,
what, as humans, we love to help people. And if we can help
exactly.
somebody grow,
Exactly.
life is beautiful, right?
And when you help someone, they appreciate it, and then they help you, and that's how you build a relationship. I think the best startup founders have a lot of relationships, and they do that by helping people, and in exchange, those people help them.
That's brilliant. Well, Larry, I've thoroughly appreciated our time today, and it was so much insight. Anything else you want to add that you're like, if you're starting a business, you got to do X, Y, Z? Anything else? Because you've given me a lot of wisdom today. So anything
I
else?
think when I was younger, I always feared starting a business to some degree,
Hmm.
because it's scary, right? And even nowadays, I'll go to universities, I'll go to MBA programs, and they'll ask me, and I'll often hear someone say, "Hey, I want to be an entrepreneur long term, but I want to do this first. I want to, become, a VP in this, learn technology, learn ops, get all of these different skills." And I think that's the wrong way to go about it, because when you're in a startup and you're working with something that has never been done before, the things that are going to make the difference are not the experiences you have, but the ability to frame your mindset and solve problems quickly. No one is ever ready to be an entrepreneur. Like, there's
Hmm.
no perfect background for you. It's not a prerequisite. You don't need to do this, this, and this. You just dive into it and you learn how to solve problems quickly. And you get comfortable with the fact that there's ambiguity. And so, what I would say is, don't be discouraged by the fact that you haven't done it. And don't spend years of your life assuming that you need to have a perfect background to do it. Just dive into it. And one of the easiest, safest ways to do that is by going to work for someone else's startup. You're going to learn a lot, and it's going to make you personally comfortable. That's what happened for me. I had to work for several different startups before I had the courage to start my own, because I needed to feel comfortable that I had a high chance that I would be successful.
That's great. Thank you for that, Larry. I appreciate it. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed our time, and I wish you the best on whatever your next project is, or next. I know you're going to help a lot more people, a lot more businesses in your life, and I'm sure you'll start a bunch of your own too. So
Thanks for your time, Warren.
thank you. I hope you have a great day.